So, which reality do we want to live in? I'm Danielle Metz.
I'm Robert Vaughn.
And this is the Danielle Metz Show. Quote, "You have to realize that what we, the older generation, see as reality is not the reality the younger generation sees. And unfortunately, it's the younger generation's reality that we're living in now." Opined my husband. I had just come home from having tea with a neighbor that I hadn't seen in a while, and I'd expressed my surprise at how similar our worldviews were. She recognizes the demographic change due to open borders policy. She's aghast at the gender-fluid gobbledygook that is shoved down our throats and, more importantly, into our kids' minds. She's appalled by the Greta Thunberg environmentalism that is the regurgitation of every climate and ecological scare that has ever been force-fed to us to justify every governmental control over the last half-century or so. And don't get her started on political correctness. I see these things because I'm immersed in politics. It's in my blood, if you will. I've become used to being in the minority when it comes to these issues, given the political climate I've lived in all my life. And so I'm surprised to find that most people I interact with tend to agree with what I see as common sense. Some of them are clients, some of them are neighbors, some are family, some are people I've met through some variation thereof. They all come from different socioeconomic backgrounds and from many intersectional, dimensional, cross-sectional, whatever the current category flavor of the day might be. But they all see the rot that is the root of our culture. Not surprisingly, those that don't are typically from the younger generation, the ones that passionately believe in things they know absolutely nothing about, the ones whose perceived reality my husband warns that we are currently living in. So, Robert, should I find hope in the fact that most sensible grown-ups seem to understand that open borders are detrimental to social cohesion, that there are in fact only two genders, that we aren't actually going to die from apocalyptic climate catastrophe, and that words actually don't hurt you? Or should I despair that the next generation seems to believe the exact opposite?
Interesting. You're making me think whether or not when we were growing up, what our parents may have thought about our culture at the time. For me, it was the 60s and 70s. For you, maybe 70s, 80s, 90s?
Yeah, 80s, 90s, yeah.
Yeah, so to me, the 80s and 90s is like I have stuff in the fridge that old. So I don't consider the 80s, 90s to be too long ago. 60s and 70s,
okay. Neither do I.
You're thinking about the mists of time when I'm thinking 60s. And of course, the 50s were the before time for me. And yet my parents were born in the 30s. My father went to war, Korean War. My mother kept a house like a mother would have at the time, even though she later went out to work. So I know full well that what they thought of as the society of the day, as portrayed perhaps in the newspapers and television, movies, they were disgusted with a lot of things they saw, which I particularly like today. So when I'm thinking about the millennials or those who came after, about the society that they're going into and developing, and how I dislike a lot of it, is almost irrelevant to some of the more fundamental questions that you can ask, no matter if it's the 60s, 1960s, or 1760s, or 1560s. There are some fundamental truths out there which transcend all cultures, all genders, all intersectionalities, and I think that's what we have to focus on. Like I may lament the fact that if I go to Toronto today, it's not the Toronto from 1976 when I first visited there. It's certainly not the same city. Things change. There's absolutely no way to put the genie back in the bottle, so to speak. The demographics of our society are the demographics of our society. That's the way it is, and you and I have to accept it. We may or may not like it, the fact that there's so many people being poured into our country who hate us and hate our society and are only coming here for the welfare or maybe to change our society. And we know that there are many, many of them. All we can do is maybe lament the fact that you can't go back and try to do what we can to help mitigate any nasty effects of these new political flavors of the day right now. Like you say, it's the gender stuff for open borders.
Yeah, the one bright spot is that the next generation after the millennials, the Gen Zers, I guess they call them now, they tend to be more conservative, because the pendulum swings, right?
Yeah.
So the further it goes one way, the harder it's going to fall the other way. So that's the two extremes that we go through. It's just the damage that's going to be done to our civilization and culture when it's going the wrong way. I know eventually reality will assert itself and force it back the other way. I'm just worried about the damage going to be done. And what I don't understand is the disconnect between what we see in the media, what we see in entertainment, and just the normal, ordinary person, man on the street type character who just goes, yeah, this is stupid. I don't understand. He puts his head down, goes to work, and that's his involvement. And occasionally he might go out and vote. And then, even then, he votes based on false information provided by said media. So, I don't know. I shake my head in one respect, and the other one I'm like, at least I'm not alone.
No, you're not. And I agree with you that the vast majority of the people know that there's something wrong fundamentally. The only problem is that they don't have the time to do anything about it. And it requires a considerable amount of time that you and I have put into it. And a lot of the friends we knock around with have put into it. We live and breathe politics and philosophy. And we read the right books, if by right I mean the books that are dealing with the issues of the day from a perspective not covered on the CBC. So we read the right books, we talk to the right people, we get a broader understanding, more so than the farmer who just farmed the field next door to me. You know, he's 90 years old. I wonder what he thinks of today's culture, you know?
Oh, God. Well, you can ask my Oma. My Oma's 91 now, so you can imagine what she thinks of the culture.
Yeah, probably
she grew
just
up in World War II.
Yes. So I think there's a superficiality that most people have to deal with. For example, if they want to know who to vote for, they'll look at the debate. And the people I talk about the debate is that they don't have time for platforms because they know that they're going to be sold a bill of goods at a debate. So they just get a general feeling or impression about the trustworthiness, the amiability of the leader, and then they'll vote that party. A lot of people said, for example, that Elizabeth May from the Green Party, she answered the questions. The rest were all evading. Or Jagmeet Singh seemed to be quite an amiable character. I think I could vote for the NDP. If that's the level of thinking for a lot of the voters out there, and unfortunately it is, then I would suggest you don't vote, because that's not a valid reason to vote in my estimation. I mean, I could say, who am I to suggest what you do with your vote? And it does sound a bit arrogant. But it's very important to know what your vote does, that the power of that vote. So if you don't do your homework, if you're just going by general impressions and what the neighbor's cat said, then don't vote. Just stay home, please, because you're doing everybody a disservice. And not only that, you're doing yourself a disservice. Let's say that, I like Jagmeet Singh because he's a young, charismatic guy who knows how to speak well, and to take his knocks at the lectern during a debate. That's all well and good. All of a sudden he comes to power and your lifestyle is destroyed because of his communist philosophy and his rules. Same with Elizabeth May and the Green Party, whose goal is to destroy Western civilization as we know it. And then
Absolutely.
you get a buffoon like another Justin Harper or Justin Trudeau. The Freudian slip there, Justin Harper. Justin Trudeau getting in and making a complete ass of himself in front of on the world stage, making Canada look like a clown circus. It's just, or you can do your homework, and unfortunately, it takes a lot of time to go through the policies and the histories of the people and the parties and say, this is how I align. I align, well, you and I, with the People's Party. We've read the platform. We've met the leader. We've met the candidates.
Yep.
Right? We do our homework, and we align with the People's Party. Other
Well,
people
I agree,
are.
because voting
Other people
is a
truly are
responsibility, right?
lefties. Other people are truly socialists, and they would love to vote for an Elizabeth May or a Justin Trudeau or a Jagmeet Singh because they are socialists, and they know that, and so they go out and vote socialist. But the broader topic of the culture at large, and there's a superficiality in almost anything I find. Climate change, pollution, who to vote for in an election, gender, all of these things. Remember, we do shows on these things. You and I and your father have done over, 700 and 70 shows on topics. And before we sit down and talk about the topics, we research them, generally. We research them. We look into the facts. We look into who's the experts, who's contradicting them. And we give some time before we come out and pontificate. Normally, a 1 hour show of Just Right takes about 10 hours of individual prep.
Yep.
About 10 hours of prep to do a 1 hour show on any particular topic. People out there don't have time for that, and I don't blame them.
Yeah. Well, that's why. But that's why we do these shows.
Maybe I should.
Well, no, but that's why we do these shows, is so that they don't have to do it. We can do the research and present it for them. It's like you have to figure out there's certain sites or certain commentators or pundits that you get to know and you trust, and you know their biases because they're open and honest about it, and you can let them correlate all the information for you. So it's not, you don't have to go find out all these individual facts yourself. And most of the most trusted people I follow on YouTube and BitChute and those, they link to in the description to all of their supporting documentation. And when it comes to a vote, before what I was going to say was, it is actually a major responsibility because, as we pointed out in the past, government is a gun. Yeah. And when you cast that vote, you're casting a vote for somebody to use a gun, possibly against yourself or your neighbor. And that's why I think you're right. If you do not know what you're voting for, don't vote. It doesn't take away your right to complain, like so many people say, oh, if you didn't vote, well, you can't complain. Yeah, you can complain, because if you didn't vote, it's because you probably had no one to vote for. So you have more right to complain, is the way I would look at it. Which is why this is only the second federal election I've ever voted for, or voted in my entire life. And the first time was a vote for Stephen Harper, and that was only because of his stance on immigration. I disagreed with him on a lot of other issues. And this is the first time I've actually voted for pretty much the whole platform of a political party, the People's Party of Canada.
Now, it should be mentioned, of course, that we're recording this on Election Day, Monday. Yes. This is not going to air until Wednesday night. So if you're listening to this and we're not talking about who won the election, it's because we don't know
what happened yet. Although we both already voted, don't worry.
Oh, yes, I voted last week in the advance polls.
Yes. Yeah, my dad dragged me out to go vote as well.
Dragged you?
I was going anyway, but he was like, oh, let's go together. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, okay. Make it
Father and daughter goes voting together. And my husband actually did vote today.
Oh, good.
And he hasn't voted in an election for... He said he can't remember the last election he voted for. So that was, but he was paying attention this time around. I found that really, really interesting. I must be rubbing off on him, and he probably hates me for it.
So, I don't know. What was your original question about the lamenting the culture?
Well, it's just the fact that there are so many common sense people out there that aren't reflected in the current culture. They do tend to be more of our generation or older. And the younger generation seems to be what is reflected in the culture right now, which makes sense because they're they're the up and coming. So what we see reflected in our media and entertainment isn't what you see on the street talking to regular people. But I guess that's where the zeitgeist is these days, is with the youngins.
It's true. The 20s, that age group define a culture. They really do. If you think about the 60s, name the musical group of the 60s that sticks out in your mind. The Beatles. The Beatles, for example.
Led Zeppelin.
Okay, the Beatles were before your time. The Beatles, right?
Hey, the Beatles were my favorite group. I have posters of them all over my house, and I listen to them on a regular basis.
They wrote all their bloody tunes when they were in their 20s. Yep. All of those Beatles tunes were in their 20s. My God. That's defining of a culture. And the same goes with today's music, and the same goes with the music from the 90s and the, what do you call the 2000s?
The aughts.
The noughts?
The aughts.
And the 80s and the 70s. It's all defined by people writing movies who are in their 20s, people writing music who are in their 20s. And that's the culture that we live in. So when you click on the radio today, most of the music that you're going to be hearing there, unless it's the old classic rock that I would listen to, musicians are in their 20s. You go to the movies, most of the good actors out there today, the AA actors, if they're not a George Clooney pushing his 70s, then it's going to be a 20-something, right? That's what everybody is, that's the age, that's that decade where everybody is so active in their mind and their bodies that they just go out there and create.
Well, I think it's more so too that I think the 20-year-olds cohort has the disposable income. So regardless of who's writing the movies, directing the movies, or starring in the movies, they have to appeal to that disposable income because that's where it's going to come from. It's not going to come from the 50 or 60-year-old that's on retirement age. It's going to come from the young kid who has a bunch of money to spend and taking this girl out on a date. So I think that has a lot to do with it as well. That's why they cater it to younger people. And because most of Hollywood's controlled by a very small group of older people.
Absolutely true. And they're only in it for the money, which they should be. No problem with that. But again, this superficiality, for example, if a foreigner came over here and turned on the CBC, they would think that all of us think the way those ultra-leftists do on the CBC. In other words, single-payer healthcare is a godsend from heaven, No, half of the country don't believe in it. Half of the country would like to see some sort of private healthcare in this country. But that's not reflected on the CBC or the main pundits that you would see on Global News or CTV or any of that. They are trying to portray a Canadian culture that they want to see. And they take it for granted that everybody wants universal health care, single-payer system. They take it for granted that everybody loves open borders and is welcoming to cultures that are diametrically opposed to Western values. They take it for granted.
Diversity is our strength.
Diversity is our strength, exactly. They go out and they repeat the phrases and the bromides that they want people to think that this is Canadian culture. But if you step outside of Toronto, downtown Montreal, no, I won't even include Montreal in this, downtown Vancouver or Toronto, you find a Canada that is what you were describing. A little more down to earth, a little more common sense. They're closer to the land in the rural parts of this country than, of course, in the cities. So they have a very easy to come by understanding of what reality is because they're faced with it every day, and they don't sit in an apartment building on the 30th floor of a tower overlooking a sea of skyscrapers in Toronto.
It's like we're the equivalent of the flyover country in the United States. You've got San Fran in California on the West Coast and New York on the East Coast, and everything else is in between. And they're the sensible people. They're the flyover country that the elites don't think about. And they have a completely different political and moral outlook on life than regular, normal people who just go about their day.
I tell you, if CBC, CTV, Global News moved their headquarters from Toronto downtown, Bay Street, and moved it out to, say, Corner Brook, Newfoundland, or Oromocto, New Brunswick.
What you talking about, Bay?
Or Regina, even a smaller town like Regina, you would see a completely different reflection of Canadian culture than you do now, because the CBC, CTV, Globe and Mail, National Post, all of these people who push a particular view of Canadian culture are all living the downtown Toronto lifestyle. That's their culture. And when they go and they put themselves in front of the television cameras and the movie cameras, they're reflecting their own reality, which is not mine, it's not yours, it's not for tens of millions of Canadians, have nothing to do with the culture that is seething in downtown Toronto. And so that's why I think you can have your conversations with people who are common sense, who would love the PPC, for example, and very down to earth, and yet it's not reflected in the culture, because that culture is something set apart from Canadian society. It really is. It's not reflective of this country at all.
Yeah, and what I would recommend is everybody should go take their neighbor for a tea or a coffee, sit down with them and talk about these things, and you'll find yourself you're not as alone as you think you are. So until next time, we'll talk to you then. Cheers. Bye.
If you've enjoyed this presentation, visit justrightmedia.org for more programming that's not right-wing, it's just right.